Hello and welcome. In this episode, I'll be showing you how to find and analyze hate crime statistics. The topic of hate crimes has become much more discussed in the era of Trump. You often see memes like this one here, which make various claims about the rise in hate crimes. And of course, it's not just limited to memes either. You'll also see frequent coverage of it in news stories, which often link it with things like mass shootings or other high-profile crimes. But as I'll show you in this video, hate crime statistics are ripe for being manipulated into pushing various narratives. As for this particular meme, it's actually just flat out wrong in its statistics, and it was covered in a previous post, so if you're interested in this particular meme, I'll link that to you in the video description so you can go check that out. But in this video, I wanted to look at hate crime statistics more broadly and show you where you can find them, how to make sense of them, and how to analyze their various aspects. So the next time you run into a meme like this which makes claims about hate crime statistics or any news articles you might run into, you'll know right where to go to get the information to see if you're being lied to or manipulated. The first step is to type in FBI hate crime statistics into your search engine. Essentially, all hate crime statistics come from the FBI report. I'd be skeptical if I saw someone cite any other source. And you're going to want to go to the result, which lists the reports by year. That'll be the easiest way for you to find what you're looking for. In our case, that's the second result here. Go ahead and click on that. It brings you to a list of all the reports by year going back all the way to 1995, which was the first year where the FBI started compiling hate crime statistics. If you're wondering why the data only goes up to 2017, it's because the previous year's numbers are published every fall, so 2018 data won't be available till probably October or November of 2019. Having this page handy is useful because it allows you to easily look at different years so you can see how things have changed percentage-wise from year to year. And for now, we're going to go look at the data from 2017. That'll bring you to this page, and you're going to go to the first box here where it says Access Tables. Go ahead and click on that, and that'll bring you to this page, which essentially has all the data you're going to need to analyze hate crime statistics for a given year. If you go over to the right-hand side, you'll see that there's a bunch of different tables, beginning with the participation table, and then 14 tables below that. That's where all the data is listed and broken down into different sections. So I'll be going through most of these tables. There's a few that are sort of redundant or not terribly interesting. And I'll show you how to understand and break down the data, as it can be sort of confusing at first. And I'll show you some tips and examples on how to analyze this data. We'll see firsthand just how easy it is to create many interesting and contradictory narratives and how easy it is to mislead with this data. So let's begin with the first table, the participation table. The participation table shows you how many agencies participated in that year's report. This is important to understand and look at because the FBI report isn't some sort of comprehensive decree that lists all the hate crimes that took place in the US in one year. It relies on different reporting agencies to provide it with that information. As we can see, in 2017 we had 16,149 participating agencies, which covered a population of about 306 million versus the entire population of the US, which is somewhere around 330 million. And as you scroll down this chart, it also breaks down the reporting agencies into cities of different populations. This table becomes very important to look at when you're comparing the previous year. So if we go back to 2016, we see in the prior year, there are only 15,254 participating agencies covering a population of about 290 million. So that means that the 2017 data has about 900 more participating agencies with covering a population of more than 15 million compared to the year prior. There were a lot of media outlets that neglected to reveal this when they were reporting on the increases in hate crimes, which is obviously misleading because with an increase in the sample size, we would expect the number of hate crimes to rise. And on the other side, there were some conservative and right-wing outlets that correctly pointed this out, but ended up actually overestimating its importance. What we should be comparing between the two charts is the population covered, which increased by about 16 million, which is a 5 to 6% increase from 2016. So we would expect to see about a 6% increase in hate crimes, even if the rates had stayed the same. So we'll keep that in mind as we look through the rest of the hate crime data. Next table is Table 1, and this gives most of the headline data that's reported on by the media. On the top, it lists the total number of hate crimes reported, and with this table, we're mostly going to be interested in the incidents column. The offenses column can be a little bit misleading, as there could be multiple offenses for a single incident. For example, if somebody broke into a house to steal something and left racist graffiti, that might be considered an offense for burglary as well as for vandalism, whereas it was really just one instance of a hate crime. The victim column is also not terribly useful, as there could be multiple victims for a single incident, and their definition of victim also includes things like businesses or organizations, and even society itself can be considered a victim, so it doesn't just mean an individual. And the last category, known offenders, when they use that term, they're just referring to the fact that something was known about the person that committed the crime. It doesn't mean that the person itself is actually known, just that some aspect of them was known. So as the table shows, there were 7,175 total instances of a hate crime in 2017. And if we compare that with the previous year, 2016, we see that there's 6,121 instances. So the number increased by 1,054, which is about a 17% increase year over year. So that's where all the news headlines saying that there's a 17% increase in hate crimes came from. Although, as we saw earlier with the participation table, we would have expected a 6% increase anyway. So really it's more like a 11% increase from the year prior. If you continue scrolling down this table, you see that they break down hate crime incidents into different categories like race, religion, sexual orientation, and gender. And here I'll show several different examples on how you can create narratives based on this data. We'll start with the anti-white hate crimes, which were 741 incidents. Compared to 2016, that was an increase of 3%, so we could claim that anti-white hate crimes are on the rise. Or we could run a headline saying anti-black hate crimes rose by 16% from the year prior, or that anti-Hispanic hate crimes rose by more than both of those combined at 24%. So each one of those headlines would be valid. As for religion, the anti-Jewish hate crimes rose by 37%. Anti-Christian hate crimes are a little bit more difficult to compute because we got to add several different categories, but those increased by 23%. And if we look at anti-Muslim hate crimes, those actually declined by about 11%, which is probably a headline you've never seen. If we continue down to sexual orientation, we find that anti-gay and anti-lesbian hate crimes essentially remain flat, and if we included the increased reporting agencies, they actually declined slightly, while the anti-heterosexual hate crimes actually rose an astounding 60%. Although running such a headline would be misleading and disingenuous, as the total number of the anti-heterosexual crimes are far less than the anti-gay and lesbian. And an even more surprising statistic is that the anti-male hate crimes rose by astounding over 200%, while the anti-female crimes remained exactly the same. And as for anti-transgender, again, those remained essentially the same, or a slight decline if you include the increased reporting agencies. So again, you could take this data to create alarming headlines highlighting the increase in Black and Hispanic hate crimes, but you could also do the same highlighting the increase in anti-Christian or even anti-male, anti-heterosexual hate crimes, and at the same time point out that the good news that the anti-gay, lesbian, transgender hate crimes have remained constant or even declined slightly. Table 2 breaks down hate crimes by the type of offense. This table is very important in understanding the context behind these incidents, as when many of us hear the word hate crime, we envision something like a man chaining a minority to his truck and dragging him down the road. Very violent, traumatic types of crimes. But as we scroll down here and see the breakdown, fortunately we see that most of the hate crimes are far less serious in nature. For example, the number of murders and rapes combined only equal less than 0.5% of the total hate crimes. By far the most common hate crimes are simple assault, intimidation, and vandalism. Moving to Table 3, this breaks things down by the offender's race, so we can see who commits the most hate crimes. And the reality here is that whites commit the most hate crimes, while blacks commit the most per capita. And if we compare it to the year prior, the amount of white offenders increased by about 20%, while black offenders actually decreased by 9%, and Hispanic increased by 38%. Now, you've probably never seen a headline that highlights the disturbing rise in Hispanics that commit hate crimes, but again, this is the table that you would find that information. Table 4 had mostly redundant information, so we'll go ahead and move to Table 5, which is a pretty interesting table. This breaks down the offender's race and bias motivation. So this allows us to see both the race of the offender as well as who they were targeting. And one surprising thing about looking at this is that you can see sometimes an offender will actually target members of their own race. So if we look at white offenders, we see that there's 182 instances of them committing anti-white hate crimes, which sounds kind of bizarre, but again, the technical definition of a hate crime is to target somebody based on their characteristics. And even funnier than that, if we look at the prior year, there was actually a 38% increase in white on white hate crimes, which would make for an unusual but correct headline. But it is interesting to look at some of these incidents and realize that it's not what most people would view as a traditional hate crime. But to be fair, most of these instances do tend to target somebody of a different race or ethnicity. If we take a look at whites, they tend to target predominantly African Americans. If we look at African Americans, they tend to target whites, while Hispanics will tend to target African Americans. Another interesting thing with this table that we can see if we scroll down to sexual orientation and gender identity is that a disproportionate amount of anti-gay, lesbian, and transgender hate crimes are committed by blacks, to the point where there's actually even more hate crimes committed by blacks against transgender despite their much smaller population. Moving on to Table 6, this is a relatively simple but interesting chart which breaks down the hate crime offenses by victim type. The first thing that jumps out here is that not all hate crime victims are individuals. In fact, there's a good number of offenses that are directed at businesses, government, religious organizations, or even society. And when we compare this to the 2016 data, we see that the individual victims rose by 11%, while business victims rose by 30%, government by 28%, religious institutions by 12%, and society as a victim rose by a whopping 190%. So while the majority of hate crimes are still directed towards individuals, the rise in hate crimes seems to be predominantly targeted toward institutions. Tables 7 through 10 don't really have any new useful information in my opinion, so let's go ahead and skip to Table 11, which breaks down offenses by state. This table is interesting because we can see where the hate crimes are occurring and where they're not. I find this table particularly interesting because I haven't seen any news outlets cover the data here, even though there are some pretty interesting narratives that could be created. From this table, we can see that California has the most hate crimes of any state by far at 1,270, which is more than 2 times the next closest state. While this would be expected given that they have the largest population, this number is still out of whack, as we can see by looking at other large states like Florida, which only has 166, and all the way down to Texas with 219. So pretty shockingly, California has almost 6 times the amount of hate crimes that Texas does, despite having a population only about 25% greater, and both being border states with diverse populations. Another surprise is that the state with the second most amount of hate crimes is Washington State at 613, which is actually more than New York State at 559, putting it way out of line given its population. Other states with high amounts of hate crimes given their population include Oregon and Ohio, Minnesota, Michigan, and Massachusetts, Kentucky, District of Columbia, and Arizona. Just as surprising is where hate crimes aren't happening. For example, Deep South states like Alabama. One would think that if the rise in hate crimes were due to the rhetoric of Trump, you'd find large numbers in deep red states where his most devoted fans were. Yet when you look at a state like Alabama, we find that there's only 9 total hate crimes in the entire state for that year, which was a 47% decrease from the year prior. And of those 9 crimes, none of them were murder, rape, or aggravated assault, and just one was a simple assault. So this is a pretty incredible statistic that there was only 1 hate crime assault in the entire state of Alabama in 2017. And this wasn't an anomaly limited to Alabama. If we look at some of the rest of the Deep South, Arkansas had just 8 total hate crime offenses, which was, again, a decrease of 47%, just like Alabama. And Louisiana had just 30 hate crimes, which was a decrease of 10% from the year prior, while Mississippi had only 4 total hate crimes in the entire state, a decrease of 60%. There are other deep red Trump states like West Virginia, which also follow this narrative, but also some that run totally counter to the narrative like Kentucky and South Carolina, which both had huge increases in hate crimes year over year. So as with most of these hate crime narratives, it tends to fall apart when more context is given, but nevertheless, it is pretty interesting that a lot of deep red Trump country has such little amounts of hate crime. In fact, it appears some of the safest places in the entire country when it comes to hate crimes is actually the Deep South. Table 12, this breaks down by state the number of participating agencies as well as the population that they cover and the number of agencies which submitted incident reports on hate crimes. There are a couple interesting things to point out with this table. First, if we look at the agencies which submitted incident reports, there are only 2,040 which did so out of over 16,000 total reporting agencies. So that means only about 1 out of 8 agencies reported any hate crimes at all, and the vast majority didn't report any hate crimes. The second thing I'll point out about this chart relates to the previous table where we saw that certain states, particularly in the Deep South, had surprisingly low numbers of hate crimes, for example, Alabama. And the skeptic might have asked, well, what about the number of reporting agencies? Maybe they had less reporting in 2017, which is why their numbers went down. But in reality, the opposite is true. If we see here in 2017, Alabama had 334 reporting agencies covering a population of 2.9 million, whereas the year prior, they had just 28 reporting agencies covering only 1 million. So from that, we can see they had more than double the population covered in 2017 and yet still had that decline in hate crimes, which makes that statistic even more surprising. There are likely many other narratives that you could come up with if you took the time to analyze each state, but those are just a couple examples. The last two tables, 13 and 14, is where you can zero in and see which agencies did and didn't report hate crimes. This could be useful if you're trying to figure out how many hate crimes happen in your city, or perhaps you're researching a certain region and you want to know how many hate crimes happen there. So first, Table 13 lists the agencies which did report the hate crimes, and it breaks it down by state. So if we click on a state, say North Dakota, we're able to see which agencies reported hate crimes. So we can see there's about 8 different agencies which reported hate crimes in North Dakota, and you can see which types of hate crimes they were as well as which quarter they were reported in. So that's Table 13. If we go back, we can see Table 14, which shows us all the agencies which reported 0 hate crime data for all 4 quarters. So again, if we go to North Dakota, now we can see all of the agencies which reported 0 hate crimes, which, as we can see, is a much longer list. And that's not unique to North Dakota. Any state you go to, you'll see that there are far more agencies which reported 0 hate crimes than those that did. Now that we have experience looking at the different FBA tables, I'll bring up one last important factor, which is historical context. Hate crimes tend to fluctuate each year, so in order to determine if our current trend or year's data is something that should alarm us, it's important to look back to see the broader historical context. So the first page that we started off at is the best place to do this, as it lists the data by each year. So for example, if we wanted to go back about 10 years, let's say to 2008, click on that. We already know that we should click on this first access tables link, which brings us to all our data tables here on the right. So click on table 1. You can see in 2008 that there were 7,783 incidents of hate crime. So that is actually a higher amount of hate crimes than in 2017. In fact, they decreased by about 8% since 2008. And now, of course, we also know to check for the number of reporting agencies. So if we go back, remember that's in the participation table, and we can see that population covered is only 269 million back in 2008 versus over 300 million now. So not only did the number of hate crimes decrease by 8%, but the population also increased substantially as well. And we could go back even further, let's say to the year 2000. We go back this far, they do have a little bit different format in recent years, but you'll still find all the same tables, table 1 through 14. You just have to scroll through them a little bit differently. For example, here we see the participating agencies table. So we can see that the population covered back in 2000 was just 236 million, so about 70 million fewer than today. And if we go to table 1, we can see that there was 8,063 incidents in year 2000, which is about 12% more than in 2017. So given this historical context, our current hate crime numbers don't appear to be particularly alarming. In fact, the overall trend appears to be improving. Thanks for watching. Hope you found it informative. Be sure to subscribe to this channel if you haven't already done so. I'll be coming up with some more tutorials on different topics in the future. Until then, so long.